In Echoes Across Charlottesville, we talk about a moment that defines so many modern investigations. When law enforcement knows multiple crimes are connected, but cannot yet put a name to the DNA. In that case, the technology to close the gap simply didn't exist. Today, it does. This interview focuses on investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, one of the most powerful and misunderstood tools in modern forensic investigation. To help explain how it works, where its limits are, and why ethics and consent matter, I'm joined by Katie Thomas, co-founder and president of Moxxy Forensics. Moxxy is a nonprofit that partners with law enforcement agencies across the country to help identify unknown victims and perpetrators of violent crimes, often in cases that have been cold for decades. Their work doesn't replace police investigations. It doesn't bypass the courts, and it doesn't rely on secret databases. Instead, it operates in the space between science, public records, and informed consent. In this conversation, Katie walks through how IgG actually works, why consumer DNA sites like Ancestry and 23andMe are not accessible to law enforcement, and how opt-in databases function, and what safeguards exist to protect privacy while still allowing families to finally get answers. This interview is a companion to Echoes Across Charlottesville, but it also stands on its own as a deeper look at how justice, technology, and ethics intersect long after headlines fade. So, I appreciate you joining,
Yeah,
Katie. Do you want to give a little introduction to yourself and to Moxxy?
sure. So my name is Katie Thomas. I am a co-founder, the president, an investigative genealogist, and the business manager for Moxxy Forensic Investigations, which is a 501c3 nonprofit based in Texas, but we have cases across the United States conducting investigative genetic genealogy for law enforcement investigating agencies to identify unidentified human remains and perpetrators of violent crimes.
Awesome. So can you tell us a little about your background and how you became involved in forensic genetic genealogy?
Sure. Kind of a long story. I grew up with law enforcement. My father was a police officer. My uncle was a detective. So growing up, the whole time I knew I wanted to work. I wanted to be a detective. I wanted to work cold cases. So I went to get my undergrad in psychology with the plan of pursuing forensic psychology, and then got married to my high school sweetheart. Only one of us could do graduate school at a time, so we let him go. And so I started working, and I became an investigative social worker in Oklahoma for 10 years. And it kind of scratched that investigative itch, but it was not working with crime and criminal investigations. So I did that for 10 years, and then we relocated to a different state, to Texas, and I became a stay-at-home mom. And I love doing that. I love my children, but I had that investigative itch that I wanted to work. I wanted to work in this field, and so at that time, I started volunteering for an organization called the Doe Network, which is a volunteer organization that's an online database that matches missing persons with unidentified human remains strictly through research. So I became a researcher for them, and then I'm now all still with them, and I am the director for Texas, Louisiana, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and also the regional manager for most of the Northeast part of the United States. So I was doing that. I was able to kind of have that going. And since I was a teenager, I was a genealogist. Always been the family historian, love history, love learning about our ancestors and where we come from. And then the arrest of the Golden State Killer happened in 2018. And that brought everything, this whole field to light, and it melded every interest I had together. So I quickly started pursuing any education I could find on the field. And then I got an internship, learning, actually working on real cases, this process. I did that for 18 months before I graduated. But during that internship, I met the other two co-founders of Moxxy. So we all did the internship together, we completed it, and we were ready to start doing this on our own together. So Moxxy was born.
How does Moxxy's work differ from traditional forensic DNA analysis? What makes IgG a next step in solving cold cases?
So traditional DNA analysis is primarily focusing on for CODIS, so STR markers on DNA strands. And so that's kind of very limited. So if we're looking at forensic genetic genealogy, we use SNP markers. And so that's many more markers. And so we are able to identify people from very, very, very distant relatives, whereas CODIS is going to be much, much closer relatives. So we have a little more freedom with what we're working with to be able to make those identifications.
Okay. Can you share a recent success story or example that illustrates what you guys do?
Sure. So I'll talk about the one that I kind of talked about recently. We just had a solve we were able to announce here in Harris County, Texas. It's the identity of our Harris County Jane Doe from 1992. She was a Jane Doe that was found in the woods by a passerby in September of 1992. And they weren't able to identify her at the time, so she became a Jane Doe. And I was looking one day with Moxxy. We do a lot of outreach on our own where we're cold calling agencies saying, hey, we saw this case. We would love to be able to help you with this case. And I was looking on the National Missing and Identified Persons System, which is NamUs for short. And it's a database that agencies, some states require the usage, some states do not, but a lot of agencies still utilize it, where they have to put in their missing persons and their unidentified remains. And so I was looking on that database and I came across this Jane Doe. And one of the things that kind of speaks to me when I'm looking for cases are cases that there is very little information and there are often not sketches of what the person may have looked like in life, just because I feel those are easy to overlook. There's no attention really on those. And so those just kind of draw me in a little more. So I saw this Jane Doe and I reached out to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Science and asked if they would allow us to do this. And so for all of our cases, we have an agency agreement that we have to get signed. And in this situation, we had to get a fundraising agreement signed because the agency does not have funding for these cold cases like this. So we went to work trying to fundraise for this case, and we got a phone call from Derek Levasseur of Big Brother. He was a Big Brother winner, I think several seasons ago, and he owns Criminal Coffee Company, which they sell coffee and they have proceeds that they get that go towards actual casework. So he called us and said he would love to fund this case for us. And funding of the cases, we're looking at funding for all of the lab work, which is the extraction and the sequencing and the bioinformatics to get the DNA profile. So there's that cost. And then even just uploading the DNA data profile of the unidentified remains to the databases that we are allowed to use is another very high cost. And then with the genealogy, the efforts that our team puts into it is a cost. So it is a pretty high cost. So he was able to take care of that for us because most of our fundraising cases can take 18 months or more to get enough funds for one case. So we got to work and he actually loaned us 2 of his genealogists who have now become official members of our Moxxy team. They're wonderful. And so we had a team of 8 genealogists that went to work last December on this case. And within a month, through the Christmas holidays, we were able to identify the family that we believe this candidate belonged to. And so we always do a report for our cases. We gave the report to the agency. And with forensic genetic genealogy, the agency itself has to do the confirmatory testing. So we're a tool in their toolbox, and we're giving them a report saying, based upon our investigation, based upon the DNA and our proof of life searches, this is who we believe your candidate is for this identification. And then they will go to work and they will confirm that candidate. So in this situation, we gave them the report. And in July of this year, we got the notification that the identity was confirmed to be Joanne Zamora, who was a 29-year-old mother of 6 children. And she was a wonderful, loving mother. And we were able to speak with her daughter multiple times. And the story that the family had been told is that she was supposed to come visit them for Easter in 1992, and she did not show. And the children just thought she had left them. And that was never the case. She was unfortunately murdered. And so at this point, the Houston PD now has an open homicide investigation. And Derek Levasseur of the Big Brother, he is offering a $5,000 reward leading to the arrest of the person responsible. But very heart-wrenching case, but being able to have that connection with the daughter as well and know her story and what she was told is, it helps kind of solidify why we do this.
Before IgG existed, what were the limits of traditional DNA profiling through CODIS?
Yes. So When you're looking at CODIS, that only looks at STR, short tandem repeat markers of the DNA. So that looks at about 13 to 20 markers, depending on what comparison that they're doing, which is a very limited number. So when you're looking at those markers in CODIS, you're only able to look at what's actually in CODIS. So for it to have a match, there has to be the actual person in CODIS, or there has to be a very close family member. I'm talking a parent, a child, sibling, a full sibling, for you to get a match. And so unfortunately, you do have a lot of cases go cold because the DNA for the STR markers gets uploaded. And if those people are not in there, then you're not going to have a match. So you're stuck. Yeah.
Okay. And I know you kind of addressed this a little while ago, but we'll go ahead and ask this. For those new to this field, what exactly is a SNP profile and how is it different from the standard STR profile in CODIS?
Sure. So the STR, markers, like I said, that's looking at 13 to 20 markers. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. So that actually measures about 600 to 700,000 markers on the DNA strand. So what we are able to get from that is we're able to identify an individual based on relatives that are, we get a list of DNA matches that are fourth, fifth, sixth cousin, twice removed. We get very, very distant matches. And we're able to still identify the person based on those very distant matches because there's so many markers that are measured in this. And so whereas with CODIS and with STR, you only have what's in that database and it has to be close.
Okay. So in simple terms, can you walk us through how a case goes from unknown DNA to a possible suspect or a family tree?
Sure. So there's the DNA sample that the agency has, and we reach out on the case. They say, yes, you can have it. So we get all of those required agreements in place and we get the funding secured. Once that is all done, we partner with multiple labs across the United States. And so we look at what the sample is and maybe how much degradation there is. And then we choose one of our partner labs that would be the most cost efficient and be able to work with that sample. And the agency never ourselves touch the DNA sample. We want to maintain chain of custody at all times. So the sample goes directly from the agency to our partner lab. And then once that sample arrives at the lab, they extract the DNA. Then they are going to sequence the DNA. And then they're going to create a data profile, which is going to be what's given to us. So we are given a DNA data profile to upload to the databases that we are approved to use for genealogy. And so that's going to be GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice. For us, Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch both have a charge for law enforcement usage. And like I said, most of our cases are fundraised. So we typically start with GEDmatch. And then we may later get funding for Family Tree DNA if we find it necessary. And then DNA Justice is actually a nonprofit that is strictly for law enforcement, so there is no charge there. So we always use DNA Justice. And then we upload that DNA data profile into those databases. And it has to kind of batch overnight. So we'll upload it in the evening, and by the next morning, we have our DNA match list. So GEDmatch, for example, will be able to get the DNA match list. And then our team, which is typically 5 to 10 genealogists, will go to work building out family trees of each of those DNA matches. Now, and when I say that, we're typically not just given a list of, 10 matches. We typically have 100 or more matches. So we go to work building the trees and trying to make those connections. So we are clustering the people out that connect to each other. So if you think about your own family tree, people on your paternal side will likely connect and people on your maternal side will likely connect. So we're making connections on each side of our unidentified individual, and eventually we will find that connection, which is called the crossover couple, which would be like, for example, your parents would be your crossover couple from your maternal to your paternal side. So once we find where that connection comes together, then we know that our unidentified individual is going to be underneath that couple. So we will start building those downlines of that family tree to identify all the descendants. And then we start our proof of life search. So then once we get to the right, let's say, sibling group, for example, then we'll start looking for proof of life. So let's say we had a John Doe that died in 1980. We're looking for any proof of life of every John Doe in the right age range in that sibling group that we're trying to see if there's anybody living after 1980. And if we find 5 brothers, we have 4 brothers who we can find obituaries for and death certificates for after 1980, but we can find nothing for this 5th brother, then maybe he's likely our candidate because we can find no proof of life for him after 1980. So that's kind of how it works. And then once we have that candidate identified, then like I said earlier, we'll create a report for the agency. We'll turn that over to them, and then they will do the confirmatory testing and then notifies us once that's complete and confirmed.
Great. Okay. We often hear about the Golden State Killer case as a turning point. From your perspective, why was that case so pivotal for the field, both scientifically and legally?
So, genetic genealogy as a practice had been around for a little while in family historical research, but this was the first case that it was really utilized or really brought to the public light of it being utilized in forensic investigations. So, like I said, in my story, that was my first understanding of what this field was from that arrest. So, it brought it to the forefront. It encouraged people to upload their DNA data to the databases that can be used for this purpose, which is exciting because that's what's going to create more case closures, more connections. So it got all of that out there, but it also got out there the need for regulation of this field, this blooming field, and terms of service regulations for all the databases that can be used to make sure that genetic privacy is upheld and that people understand what their DNA is being utilized for.
What kind of database or public data access makes this possible? What kinds of privacy safeguards are out there to protect people who upload their DNA just for genealogy? I noticed that you haven't yet mentioned like 23andMe or Ancestry, which is what I think most lay people are familiar with. So can you kind of talk to us about that?
That's really where the difficult part of our field comes in, because there is a very big misunderstanding out in the public that if you have done your DNA on Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, that people doing what I do have access to your DNA data. And that just is not true because the terms of service in those databases do not allow for your DNA data to be utilized for forensic investigations. So we can't access that. And so whereas like Ancestry, for example, has millions of users, the databases that we are allowed to use, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice, have a very limited number of people who have uploaded their DNA. And the way that works is that you have to go into Ancestry, 23andMe, those consumer database sites, and you have to download your raw DNA data profile from those sites to your hard drive, and then upload that data profile into those 3 databases that we are allowed to use. And then once you do that, you have to, for Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, you have to opt in saying that you allow your DNA to be utilized for these purposes, because it's very important to have informed consent, and your DNA it's your property, it's your person, and we want to make sure that you know what your DNA is being used for. So we want to build the public trust, and we want to be very transparent with what we're doing, and we never want to violate that. So this is a way to ensure that people are fully understanding that this is what this is used for, and they are allowing that usage.
Awesome. So if someone's thinking about doing a 23andMe or Ancestry for family tree stuff, and they're hesitant because they're worried that it might be used for this, and they don't necessarily want that, they don't have to really, that has been addressed already.
Yeah, they do not have to have that concern. And just as a genealogist and a family historian, I really encourage people to utilize Ancestry and 23andMe. Ancestry has some very, very cool tools that you can use in your own personal family history research. So I think, if you want to learn about where you're from, don't be scared that using your DNA and Ancestry means that we're going to use it for law enforcement investigations. You have to give us that permission. So I strongly encourage everyone to utilize those consumer database services just to learn about their own family and where they're from.
Once you get that list back from GEDmatch or wherever, and you start actually building these family trees, at that point, do you make use of more commercial data like Ancestry, or do you like do it the old-fashioned way for genealogy and you're looking at census data and newspapers and stuff like that?
Yes, all of our people are trained like traditional genealogists. So once we are able to have that DNA match list, the majority of our work is like record searching. So we're looking at census records, death records, birth records. We're building out family trees. Like when I say that, I'm talking like we're building out trees back to like 1700s for every person. So we're very deep into, because there's nothing like that, so we're very deep into records at that point. For our company especially, we do a lot of like minority cases that are underrepresented in the databases. So we're doing a lot of like records in Spanish, records in French, and so it's very difficult, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit. About that makes it very challenging to solve a lot of cases, because when we're limited with the number of DNA matches in the databases, and then on top of that we're limited to the number of records available depending on the country we're working out of, it can be very, very challenging.
Okay. Wow, you piqued my interest there.
Good, that's the goal. I do want to mention that when we're talking about the uploading of the DNA data profile, on our website, we actually have instructions, step-by-step instructions with pictures, because that's very daunting for a lot of people to understand that process. And so we walk through it completely with you to make sure you understand how to do that. I really, like I said, I recommend that everybody do that. But even, people, who are novices at this, there's so many available records on Ancestry. And then, once you test your DNA, you get that list of your own DNA matches. And the tools that they have, they make it so easy to figure out connections and stuff within your own tree. It's very cool. So I highly recommend it.
If a law enforcement agency wanted to revisit a case
Mm-hmm.
with your help, what would that process look like from first contact to potential identification?
Sure. So let's say we've talked to the agency, and, like I said earlier, our first thing is we want to have an agreement in place that ensures that the agency is allowing us to work on the case. Once we have that in place and we have that funding, we are going to have, like for our organization, we'll have our laboratory coordinator, which is Olivia McCarter. She will look at what sample is available. A sample could look like, for unidentified human remains, it could be a bone, it could be teeth, which bones, but it could be teeth, it could be paraffin wax blocks of DNA material, it could be a blood card, which blood cards are wonderful because they are cheaper than extraction from bone. So it could be that. It could even be that there is leftover extract from the CODIS upload. So we're able to just contact, the lab that did that and just get that, leftover extract, which is a lot cheaper. And then, of course, for perpetrator cases, it could be blood, it could be semen in most cases. So she'll look at that, what sample they have available, and she'll determine that lab. And, when we talked about like what quality of sample you would need, one thing we kind of struggle a lot with is degradation of the sample. So, we work a lot of old cases. And it is not impossible, a case immediately comes to mind of a degraded sample. We had a Jane Doe from 1976, and she was cremated after she was not able to be identified. And so, once someone's cremated, it's, it was pretty assumed that she would not be identified. This is in Alabama, and they were able to find a ceramic dental mold in an evidence, closet that had rat feces on it that had been handled by multiple people. And we were able to have our lab use an MVAC machine to get a very high DNA profile from that ceramic dental mold. So even with degraded samples, it's possible to do this kind of work. So, and we're only looking for like 1 nanogram, of the sample to be able to utilize. If it's super degraded, maybe 10, but it can work where maybe it didn't work in the past on other extractions.
Wow. All right. So there's a lot of public fascination, obviously, with DNA solving everything. Thinking about capabilities and limitations, what is a realistic expectation once you guys get involved and start working on one of these cases? What can IGG do and what can't it do?
Sure. Once we get past the funding hump, which is always a very big hump to cross over to even get to that point, once we start genealogy, the limitations you're looking at is, and let's say even before we get to the genealogy, degradation can play a role. So whereas our labs are very highly specialized in degraded remains, sometimes maybe if the remains were in water for a long time or in the elements a long time, they are just too degraded for the current technology. It doesn't mean that in the next year, it's not going to be possible. So we get past the funding, we get past the degradation, and we're actually doing genealogy. The limitations are that, records. If we're building back family trees, and let's say we're working on an African-American individual, with records, we're going to hit a slave wall. So we're going to get that point in records in the 1800s where the records stop or they're very difficult to find. And that makes it very challenging in those cases. And then we have what's called endogamy. That means that in a family tree, that people may have intermarried within their community or within their bloodlines. And so it can cause a collapse of their generations, a pedigree collapse. And so someone may be related to someone else 5 times over. And so whereas to us, it may look like we have some very high matches, once we actually start building out the records and looking at everything, it's because it may look very high, but it's because they're related multiple times over because there's intermarriage happening. So that can cause a challenge. So, we run into all of those. And then the other big challenge that we have are the number of testers in the databases that we are allowed to use. Like I said earlier, if you're looking at like Ancestry, there are millions of users. If you're looking at GEDmatch, there's maybe around 2 million people. Typical like DNA matches that we are getting are like fourth, fifth, sixth cousins. We are very fortunate to get, first, second, like that rarely happens. And in those cases, when those happen, we've solved cases in 30 minutes. But we do a lot of Latin American cases. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of Latin American testers in those databases. So it can take us, like I said, we've had one case now open for 3 years that we are continuing to work on every single day. But his matches that we are given are so low that we do what we can with the matches that we have. And we never know in any case until the moment we upload that DNA data profile what we're going to get. So we may upload it, there may be a sister or a brother in there, and it's done like that. But until the public really understands the process of uploading their DNA data and then allowing it to be utilized for this purpose, it's only going to grow the databases. So here in 5-10 years, things are going to change. People are understanding what this is, and they're doing more DNA tests and uploading more, and it changes the game for us. But right now, we are limited with records and DNA data matches.
Wow. It's interesting you say that. So with 2 million, roughly 2 million
Mm-hmm.
samples in GEDmatch, and I went and pulled the stats in 2005 or 2009. It may have been 2009.
Mm-hmm.
That's how many were in CODIS, was 2 million.
Wow. That's interesting.
It's 20 million now.
So it's yeah. So things are growing, and
Yeah. Now, of course, what benefited CODIS was making it mandatory for arrestees and
exactly.
felons and stuff like that. But I don't know. Maybe that will. You never know. I mean, there are a lot of missing people.
Well, and the thing about people have to understand too with CODIS is that there's kind of multiple facets to that database, and so there is the component that's for people who've been arrested, for perpetrators, but then there's the other component that's for families. So if people are missing someone, going to their local office and making sure that someone's reported missing, but then they're also putting familial DNA in CODIS because who knows if someone's been found and the remains samples in CODIS, but until that family member is in CODIS, then there won't be a hit unless IgG is pursued. People, just across the board, people understanding what availabilities are, there to them.
Awesome. So this is probably a good one. Some agencies are still hesitant to use IgG. What misconceptions or concerns do you most often have to address? So this is from law enforcement.
From law enforcement, the biggest question I get is funding. And I hate to kind of go back to that, but that is such a huge facet of this because agencies, most ones that we talk to, do not have any funding for this kind of work, cold case work, especially agencies that have a large number of cold cases. The funding is just not there. So that's the biggest question is, we don't have funds. What do we do? So we have to help them through that. So, for Moxxy, we will fundraise for agencies. There are grants available. We will apply for grants for the agencies. We'll do whatever we can to help the agencies get the funding. The other concern is that they want to ensure that chain of custody is always maintained. And like I said, for our organization and anyone else doing this kind of work, the organization itself we don't touch the DNA samples. So we always ensure that chain of custody is always met. And then they want to make sure that we are being transparent with our work and we are, not violating terms of service of the databases. So, which is part of our agreement, is that we are ensuring, we're telling the agency we're not going to violate any terms of service. We're going to do exactly what we're supposed to do here. And then some agencies have the concern that they don't want people spoken to. They don't want, any outreach to happen, or if they do, they want to do the outreach, which is absolutely, acceptable and amazing. So it's just making sure the agencies know that, we're a partner, we're a tool for them. They are the owners of the case. They are the owners of the DNA sample. And so we are just here to assist their investigation and help provide them that candidate. And then they do their final investigation after that, whether it's a perpetrator case or a remains case. They're confirming it. They're doing additional investigation on like a perpetrator case. We're just a tool. So just to help them. And we understand it's scary to, IgG is primarily private organizations. It's not within, the agencies. So it's scary to, reach out to someone not within your own agency. And so we are very much a partner in this. And at the end of the day, the agency, us, anyone involved in this wants to just bring closure to the cases and for, resolution for the agencies and for the families.
Very good. Where do you think IGG will be in 5 or 10 years? Will it become a standard in homicide investigations, do you think?
I would love for it to be. I do understand the necessity of making sure that all investigative leads are exhausted and that, CODIS is checked first because it's, cost efficient as well. You're talking about, several $1,000s for just lab work for IGG. So for agencies, especially ones who don't have a budget, it's much easier to do the standard testing that you would normally do. However, we've seen it happen in hot cases recently. And I think it's going to continue to happen. And I do foresee IGG becoming much more popular on hot cases throughout. And I do see IGG coming more in-house at a lot of agencies who are able to, to do that, to be able to add those roles. I see that, but my hope is that, 5 to 10 years in this field, that there's more public trust. And so we have more people uploading and, you talked about the increase in CODIS. And so, increase in these databases, these cases that take us several years, that may be changed in 5 to 10 years. It may be that we upload a profile and we, work for a couple months and because there's so many DNA matches because people understand how this works. So I just see it across the board being more widely accepted among agencies and among the public, which is exciting. And I hope that's what happens.
It sounds to me like educating the
Yes.
public and law enforcement is really the
Huge.
challenge right
Yeah.
now. Because one of the things I'm going to bring up, I think a lot of people today realize that, you go join the military. If you're out on active duty, the military has your DNA and it's federal and it's in a database. What they don't realize is it is walled off.
Yes.
Law enforcement cannot use it without a court order. And as far as I know, no court has made that decision. Not the kind of cases we talk about. It might be a military case where the military has gotten permission to do it. But the only reason DOD has those DNA cards is for identifying remains.
Right.
So it is legally walled off. You could literally have served in the military, had a secret or top secret clearance, and you're invisible.
Right.
If they enter your DNA into CODIS, they're not going to get a match, even though the Fed already has your DNA. It's walled off. And that's the kind of thing, I don't think everyone realizes that. So someone like me, I was on active duty for 12 years. Thankfully I know the difference, but I think a lot of guys and women in my position probably feel like, well, if something did happen, they've got my DNA. Well, they do, but they don't. They do. But
yeah.
People
And
can't look at it.
No, and you have to, and that's where it's just about the public understanding, public trust. And the other thing, I want people to understand too, is that if they opt in, they allow their DNA to be utilized for these purposes. When we talk about what they're being used for, like I said, it's unidentified human remains, and it's perpetrators of violent crimes only. So if you are opting into this, it's not saying that we're going to go and look for people who have, left DNA from a robbery or something like that. This is strictly like rape homicide cases. So I personally, I understand that, your DNA is your property and you have every right to choose what is done with your DNA. But at the same time, it's bringing resolution to families to have remains identified. And when it's only used for violent perpetrators, which that's all it's allowed to be used for, it's getting violent criminals off the streets to prevent, like we talked about, it's preventing what could happen in the future.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you opt in and you submit your stuff to GEDmatch or someone, that's where it stays. They can't take it out of there and put you in CODIS.
Right, exactly. No.
You're not directly, accessible. It's got to go through this process like you're talking about, where all leads have been exhausted. They've done everything they can. We know we've got the sample; it's not matching anywhere.
Right.
Then they can go to you.
Exactly.
And the reason that you might get a hit, but part of it's because the samples are different, so much different.
Right.
You've got a lot more fidelity, but then, it's also because it's still walled off. If you could change one thing about how the justice system uses genetic evidence, what would it be?
I think ethical safeguards are a huge part of this. So, making sure that everyone doing this work, and especially on perpetrator cases where, court is going to come into play in this, making sure that we are all working with integrity. That includes the agency, that includes everyone, and that we're following the ethical guidelines so that DNA is handled appropriately, that it is, like I said, chain of custody is always maintained. And then for IGG work, that the proper databases are used. We have to make sure terms of service are followed. So that is huge. And then being transparent, like we shouldn't be getting DNA that shouldn't be gotten. It should be, people should know what they're doing, know what they're giving it to, and there should not be any side steps made. Like we should follow the rules at all times. When we are dealing with someone's DNA, that's very important, and we don't want to do that the wrong way. So I think across the board, especially perpetrator cases, we have got to follow ethics and use integrity.
Very completely. When you look at the families that are still waiting for answers, what message would you want them to hear?
Don't give up. I think technology is increasing every day. People are understanding how to help every single day. And, the case that I talked about earlier, the Joanne Zamora case, that I am still in contact with her daughter and speaking to her, not daily, but frequently. And, she never gave up. And she, yes, she was told that her mom, or she thought that her mom had just left. She was still looking for her, and we've been able to give her the answers. And of course, no one wants those answers, but it's a resolution. It's a closing to that chapter. And now, she can start the healing journey and whatever that looks like for each individual family. But I think technology will continue, and if it doesn't work today, it may work tomorrow. So continue to exhaust every avenue. Make sure that, families who are missing people know all the resources available to them. Families who, have family members who are victims of crime know that, the agencies are out there and know what they can do, and continue to exhaust the resources and get the stories out there. I think that's important, is that, don't give up. Make sure that people know what's happening.
Very good. All right, final one, and this is the big one. For
All
the
right.
listeners out there who want to support the kind of work that you guys are doing, what's the best way to help or get involved?
The biggest way to help for us, like I said at the very beginning, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. So we don't have any funding. And like I said, most agencies do not have funding either. So we are fundraising constantly for most of our cases. And so even today, I think last I counted, we have 8 cases currently on the website that are in fundraising, and we're getting ready to add several more. The average case cost for our cases are $7,500 per case. So, we are constantly begging for donations of any kind. And even if it means that you don't get your $3 coffee that day and you donate the $3, that helps. That goes a long way for us. So any amount, no matter how small, that you can give is incredible, and people are able to donate directly on our website. For people who don't have the ability to donate right now, that's okay. We ask that you follow our social media platforms and our website. When we are working on difficult cases, we will often share, if we've been able to determine certain areas of interest or surnames of interest on a particular case, we will share that information. And so even just being aware of that information, maybe that connects to you. Maybe you recognize the surname or the area. And so you can reach out to help. Or maybe if you see that information, you're able to share it on your own social media. That's a huge help, just following what we're doing. We often have events where we raise money for cases. So people who are interested in this field or in true crime, we will have speakers come on and we raise money for our for our cases. So we'll do that, which is always great. And then finally, helping Moxxy, but helping every organization do what we're doing. Checking out our website for the instructions on how to upload your DNA to those databases. That's huge for us. So even taking the time to go in, and if you've done the consumer DNA test, uploading your raw DNA data file to GEDmatch, Family Tree, or DNA Justice, that's incredible. And like we said earlier, building those databases is what's going to make these cases close quicker. So those are all amazing ways to help. But just being aware of what we're doing and, following us is awesome. So we appreciate any support we can get.
All right.
No.
Well, I'd really appreciate you taking the time to.
Thank you for asking. This has been wonderful.
My thanks again to Katie Thomas for taking the time to explain not just how investigative genetic genealogy works, but how it should be used. If there's one takeaway from this conversation, it's this. IGG is not about shortcuts. It's about patience, consent, and doing the work the right way. Organizations like Moxxy Forensics exist because many law enforcement agencies don't have the funding, personnel, or technical capacity to pursue this kind of work on their own. As a nonprofit, Moxxy relies on public support to help fund casework, laboratory testing, and genealogical research that can give names back to the unnamed and answers back to families who have waited far too long. If you want to learn more about Moxxy's work, how investigative genetic genealogy is used ethically, or how you can voluntarily upload your own DNA to opt-in databases to help with violent crime investigations, you can visit www.moxxyforensics.com. There, you'll also find information on how to support their efforts directly, whether through donations, awareness, or simply understanding how this process works. Again, this conversation ties back to Echoes Across Charlottesville and to a larger theme that runs through this series: the gap between knowing and proving, and the tools that sometimes arrive too late but still matter. Stay curious, and thank you for listening.